It's also like Hillary didn't say that. But, anyway.
All right.
On the show.
Welcome to Pod Save America. I'm John Favreau.
I'm Tommy Vitor.
I'm John Lovett.
And joining us as a guest co-host for the day is the host of the podcast, Why Is This Happening? And the Emmy award-winning host of All In with Chris Hayes. Chris Hayes.
Hey, guys. I like the fact you led with the podcast.
We're
on a podcast.
It is
led with my podcast.
Outstanding podcast,
Thanks,
too.
man.
So I want more people to listen to it.
It really is. Makes you smarter.
So we have a lot of news to cover today, from Trump backtracking on his decision to hold the G7 at Doral, to updates on impeachment, to all the latest primary news. And later we will have an excerpt of the interview that Tommy did with Susan Rice on Friday about her new book.
Ben Rhodes and I spent some time with Susan on Friday. You can hear part of it today and then the rest on Pod Save the World on Wednesday.
Lovett, how was Love or Leave It?
It was fantastic, John. Thanks for asking. We had Michaela Watkins and Moshe Kasher, who were fucking funny.
I love Moshe Kasher so much.
They were both so funny.
You know his background is amazing.
It's wild, yeah.
He's like orthodox,
Yeah, no, we began the show by remarking on the fact that the three of us were in Temple together, and then we made a joke about something that happened in Temple, and then the Temple official Instagram messaged it to their basically saying, like, we're everywhere, we're everywhere. And then also John Gonzalez
Seems
from The
a
Ringer.
lot more chill than the Catholic Church.
Famously, Temple's very chill. Yeah. And then we had John Gonzalez from The Ringer who walked me through the NBA China fracas.
Oh, that's good. The 2.3 point foul shot thing too.
I went over all the details about
full
that.
Primer.
LeBron's whole thing.
LeBron's whole thing.
Some of my other favorite teams, the Spurs.
Big Admiral.
Knicks.
Nice.
Okay. Finally, some big news from us on the podcast front. We can finally announce that Crooked Media has a brand new daily podcast, What a Day, which you'll be able to hear starting next Monday, October 28th, every morning, Monday through Friday, with new episodes available at 5 a.m. Eastern. Our new hosts are comedian Akilah Hughes and politics reporter Gideon Resnick, who will help break down the biggest news of the day, help you understand what matters and how you can fix it, all in 15 minutes or less. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or go to crooked.com/whataday.
Nice.
Very excited about this.
That's a tough production schedule to get that out at 5 a.m. Eastern.
Yeah, they're going to do it at night.
Overnight.
See, that's that West Coast advantage.
My first thought is like, what's the workflow there?
Yes.
Yeah.
who's hours?
Is that a 1 a.m. wake up? No.
Really good point, Chris. A lot of people are working very hard, some weird fucking hours to bring you this awesome show.
Yes,
so
exactly.
subscribe.
Yes, subscribe out of guilt.
We've been listening to all the test pilots. They're fantastic.
Very funny.
All right, let's get to the news. About a month after the Ukraine scandal broke, the Washington Post's Phil Rucker summed up where we are in a piece headlined, "Trump's Season of Weakness," that said the president, quote, "whose paramount concern has long been showing strength, has entered the most challenging stretch of his term, weakened on virtually every front, in danger of being forced from office as the impeachment inquiry intensifies." So some people might see this and think, I've read a version of this before.
I've read a version of this like 100 times.
100 times.
Several hundred times before.
But then, on Saturday, he backs off his decision to basically give a government bailout to his failing hotel in Miami by hosting the G7 there. And then you wonder, is this time different? What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm torn on this, as I think a lot of people are. I think that when the impeachment inquiry started around Ukraine, I felt like there was a little bit of people felt like the outcome was overdetermined. Like the smart thing to think was like, well, the Senate will never remove him, as if like the future is foreordained. And I've always thought that it's more dynamic than that. Like, it is just not a fait accompli that this all goes, like, they impeach him in the House and they acquit in the Senate and then everyone moves on. Like, that's not, to me, a fait accompli. At the same time, it is the case that I have read 200 articles about that. And, like, I look, his approval rating is basically the same. Like, what's happening right now in the polling is so fascinating to me, which is that the impeachment question is essentially approaching asymptotically the approval question, where it's like there's literally no middle ground. So it's like, 52-41 is his approval, and that's what, like, should he be impeached and removed from office? It's like there's no one in the middle. It's like you either think the guy is a menace and needs to go tomorrow, or you like him, and that's it. Those are the two positions.
Yeah. Were you surprised by the Doral reversal?
I was surprised.
Why do you think it happened?
It's really interesting. I guess, like, stepping back, I am always pleasantly surprised when the old political rules apply to Donald Trump.
Totally agree.
Now, one thing that we have learned over the last 3 years is that the old political rules apply to a lot of people around Donald Trump.
Yep.
You can ask various cabinet secretaries who've had to resign in disgrace. You could ask Mick Mulvaney, who spent the weekend in a barrel.
But
it's been surprising at the moments where the political rules apply to Donald Trump, and this is an example where they do. And I think, it is true that we've read story after story where Donald Trump's season of weakness. He's the White House is once again unraveling to the barricades, what have you. But I think it's sometimes too cynical to say, oh, we've read this story before. Right. We have read this story before, but each time it gets a little bit worse for them. And this was a period of time where Donald Trump is acutely weak.
I can't remember the last time he has backed off a decision that has been so heavily criticized.
The thought I had was child separation, which was another one of those moments. I completely agree with you. Where like it was like, oh, gravity exists. It's like, you're ripping children, you're kidnapping children, and the nation is just horrified by it, and you have to walk it back. There was also a court suit which sort of forced them to do it.
Yep.
But the reporting from the Times and the Washington Post both indicate that like there was this get together at Camp David of so-called moderate Republican congressmen like the Tom Coles and your Peter Kings and those folks who were like, no,
we don't want to.
We can't defend this. It's utterly indefensible. And like that was, and again, that's like, yes, it does matter. Like he understands he's about to get impeached. Like the political calculations here have changed.
Yeah, the galaxy brains that said he would support impeachment and welcome it and see it as politically beneficial are not, like, you can't pile this many scandals on top of each other. And it does seem like a bunch of moderate senators said, Esperanto, why don't you come to your senses? You know what I mean?
But
took you a minute.
Particularly strong intervention from Senator Pierre Delicto.
How fast can someone get a Pierre Delicto reference?
C'est moi.
To your point, Chris, there was an interesting Twitter thread by Nate Cohn over the Upshot where there is actually a little bit of a delta in swing districts between those who supported inquiry into President Trump or those who support impeaching and removing him. So like maybe he's still hoping for that little bit
and there
of
is,
division.
I mean, again, all the margins matter, as we learned in 2016 when it's 77,000 votes across 3 states out of 140 million votes cast. So like the margins do matter, but I just think that like the Doral thing is also just fascinating because Mulvaney came out and it's like every defense of this guy revolves around 2 ways of defending. One is like he literally can't control himself. That's the defense. And then the other defense, which is always given in this kind of like petulant, aggrieved manner, like, why are you asking me these questions? It's like Marco Rubio's like real strength.
Yeah.
Is like
sanctimony.
It's just what it basically comes down, he cannot, in the same way that I can't speak Arabic, he can't understand the difference between right and wrong.
Right.
Like you can talk to me in Arabic all day long and it will go nowhere. I don't speak Arabic. He doesn't understand.
There's no malintent here.
Yes, that's literally
it's just Trump being
it's
Trump.
Just who he is.
That's who he is. Do you think this increases the chances that Democrats will add some of this corruption and emolument clause violation stuff to the articles of impeachment? Because my thought was, now that they have backed off this, they have basically admitted that this kind of self-dealing is wrong, and yet there are so many other examples of him doing this. We just had the fucking Scotland controversy a couple weeks ago, which we've memory hold already. DC. Trump Hotel in D.C. How many times has he visited these properties? There was another story over the weekend about how he can't stop bragging to foreign leaders about his hotel properties in private.
I would say I don't know what the right strategy is in terms of how narrow impeachment should be in terms of the specific crimes. I do believe that in terms of how they're described, they need to be described in the broadest possible terms of Trump's corruption and abuse of power. But what I do think what is being validated is the theory of those who supported impeachment for a long time, which is if you don't do this, he will be unbridled. Because I don't want to. Let me say it like this. It's imagine what would have happened if Trump announced that the G7 would have been at Trump Doral while we were still in the kind of murky semi-impeachment world of 4 months ago. Nothing would have happened. So it is showing you that the lever of impeachment is actually making a difference and making our society less corrupt.
And it was actually, to me, like when I was really taken aback by that Doral announcement, precisely because it felt to me like, whoa, this means these guys are just like whatever we want to do. Yeah. And Doral is gross and, to me, clearly unconstitutional and criminal and corrupt. But then it's like there's a lot of way worse things they could do if they just say to themselves, we're doing whatever we want to do. And I got this sort of like panic when I saw this. Like, and to me, I completely agree with you that like the presence of the impeachment inquiry, to me, the strongest argument for impeachment was always that it is some kind of restraint on his behavior.
Yeah.
And restraining him is it's almost a kind of like collective social and political project for the entire country right now.
Which, by the way, at the time was a hard argument to make.
Yes.
Because making the argument that we will do something that will restrain Donald Trump is going to get you laughed at by people all across the political spectrum.
It creates a process and a context through which you can actually do it. Because if they have no shame and they're refusing all oversight, there's just no way to hold them to account. I just want to, on top of the emoluments issue, I just want to just note that it is insane to try to have a G7 in Miami. Okay?
Yeah, can you talk about
You're securing 7 of the most important world leaders on the planet. They have massive footprint security. Sometimes, like they do them at Camp David because it's entirely secure. They did it on Sea Island, so you could take over an entire island, right? Like plopping a G7 down in Miami it's impossible to do. It's insane.
It was so funny because what was so funny about that announcement, about the Mulvaney announcement, was at one level it's like we're doing this and we don't care, but then at the other level he had to pretend there had been this like rigorous process where it's like we looked high and we looked low and we looked east and we looked west and we set these teams, and then it was like Miami in June. Miami in June is. I was like, what?
He was still doing that defense.
Saying?
He was still doing that defense. Like even while saying they weren't going to do it, he was saying like, look, we looked, and I know it's kind of seems like
persuaded.
a coincidence, but it's the best place to have it.
Famously, the hotel right near the airport is always.
I also like that it was.
Yes,
it was
exactly. He was touting that too.
And also like
right
that's
near the airport.
It's the only one, by the way.
It's
a
like
lot of
the
airports.
Hilton Garden and this.
You can't find a hotel near the airport other than Trump Doral. But the other piece of it too is I like that it was the ball was in the air long enough for Marco Rubio to catch it, and defend it, and then the sort of like the Marco Rubio defense of like, oh, I'm strong on Syria, but I don't, you're all angry at me for not picking a fight on Doral, but I'm right on this other issue. And it's like, okay, man, what percentage of the time do you need to show integrity for us to be quiet?
I will say the Trump second order excuse now about how, it was going to be free. I was going to do it at cost, or it was going to be free. Like, why do I need to do this? That's his argument, right? Which you can see some people being like, oh, well, that's interesting. But like, first of all, it was clearly a branding and marketing opportunity for this.
Also, I don't trust him to tell me what
that's
it costs. There was a report that they were charging $18 for a glass of bourbon that costs $55 a bottle, right?
At
like
the Trump
he's
hotel,
a grifting fuck. It's also
I don't trust him on hard costs and I don't trust him on soft costs.
But like to your point earlier, Lovett, like I really do think that Mulvaney's appearance expedited the downfall of this thing because Trump has managed to stay at this same level of gravity. Mulvaney is prickly. He's disliked by a lot of people within the caucus. And when he goes out and says something stupid, they wanted nothing more than just to slap him.
It also was a reminder to me because I feel torn about, there's this kind of, what happened to the presidential daily, the press conference, where the press secretary would come out. And there's this, and I'm ambivalent about that because it's like, it was a waste of all of our time, but there is a kind of transparency interest in doing it. That's the argument for it from a sort of First Amendment, like civics perspective. It was a reminder, like, there's a reason they don't come out every day.
Yeah.
I mean,
get made on
what
camera.
the hell are, you know what I mean? So, like, the one time they send someone out to do what that press secretary person would do, which is, like, kind of defend indefensible decisions, that's what happened. Like, no wonder they're not coming out.
Well, yeah, that's why Trump does all of his press conferences, like, with helicopter blades behind
He's
him.
always like,
I'm
sorry, I can't hear you.
I missed it. I got to go.
But
I'm
also,
just going to scream some crazy shit.
He's also right that he's the only person who can be his spokesman because like you see in Mick Mulvaney's eyes, like the lingering part of him that used to
feel
not
shame.
Right. Say, and Spicer felt shame. Huckabee Sanders did not.
Yeah. Which is why she was good.
Yeah, she was. And now this new person's like, I can't go out there.
Well, and I'll never forget the moment when we were talking about like when the rules of political, normal politics apply and they apply to other people. There was a moment, the Tom Price scandal, when that was blowing up. Right, he was taking all those flights, and I remember he had some event that he had to do that day.
Oh yeah.
And he's sort of walking off and getting chased with questions, and I saw in his eyes the human experience of shame. I was like, he's done.
Yeah.
I just saw shame in him. He's out. And like
gotta bury that deeper, my
a day or
friend.
two later,
No.
he's gone.
Bury
It's like
it
if you
deeper.
feel that.
You know who else was dead-eyed this weekend? Sorry, I know we're moving on. Was Mike Pompeo.
My God.
If you ever want to see a human balloon deflate on air, it happened in this question that he got from George Stephanopoulos. It was just I've never seen
great
him.
interview by
There's
George.
a pause in that, which is
5
a
second
fantastic
pause followed by like a whimpering voice.
It sounded like that. There's a clip we always play, which is Paul Manafort talking about like whether they have relation or
yeah.
That's what I said. That's what we said. That's obviously what our position is.
What we actually said. I said. That's what I did say.
Classic of the genre. We do have the clip of Mick Mulvaney attempting and failing to walk back his remarks from the White House briefing room on Chris Wallace's show on Fox on Sunday. So let's play that.
Here's my first question. Why did you say in that briefing that President Trump had ordered a quid pro quo that investigating the Democrats, that aid to Ukraine depended on investigating the Democrats? Why'd you say that?
Again, that's not what I said. That's what people said. That I said, here's what I said. I'll say it again, and hopefully people will listen this time. There were two reasons that we held up the aid. We've talked about this at some length. The first one was the rampant corruption in Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, Chris, is so bad in Ukraine that in 2014 Congress passed a law requiring us to make sure that corruption was moving in the right direction. So corruption's a big deal. Everybody knows it. The president was also concerned about whether or not other nations, specifically European nations, were helping with foreign aid to the Ukraine as well. We've talked about that for quite a while now. I did then mention that in the past the president had mentioned for me to time about the DNC server. He'd mentioned the DNC server to other people publicly. He even mentioned it to President Zelensky in the phone call,
he sure did.
But it wasn't connected to the aid, and that's where I think people got sidetracked this weekend at that press conference. Two reasons for holding back the aid.
Let me pursue that, though.
Sure.
Because I believe that anyone listening to what you said in that briefing could come to only one conclusion. Let's play what you said.
Sure. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money.
It is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happen as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
You were asked specifically by Jonathan Karl, was investigating Democrats one of the conditions for holding up the aid? Was that part of the quid pro quo? And you said it happens all the time.
Yeah, but go back and watch what I said before that. I don't know if you guys can cue it up or not. There was a long answer about corruption. And a long answer
you
about
totally said that.
Can you play a different clip?
And then I said the exact same thing I just said now, which is, did he mention in passing? Yes. But the reason that we held back the aid were the two reasons I mentioned. And I can prove it to you. The aid flowed. Once we were able to satisfy ourselves that corruption was actually, they were doing better with it. We got that information from our folks, from the conversation with Mr. Zelensky. And once we were able to establish, we had the Office of Management Budget do research on other countries' aid to Ukraine. It turns out they don't give hardly any lethal aid, but they do give a considerable sum of money in non-lethal aid. Once those two things were cleared.
So I guess my question is, what do we think Mick Mulvaney thought he was doing when he came out to the briefing and started talking about, like, what was the strategy in his head?
Well, there's two things happening. One is that he got confused. They've oscillated between two messages. We didn't do it, and we did it, and it's fine.
Yeah.
And he just forgot which one they were on.
Right.
Like because Rick Perry did that the other day in an interview in the same sentence almost. Like, this has been the call is perfect, and also it's a witch hunt, whatever. So he got confused between those two. He was trying to offer a plausible cover story. One thing I will say that drives me a little crazy, because this is like, this doesn't even crack the top 1,000 of what's crazy here. It's statutorily, the money, it's not theirs to uphold.
Right.
The money has been passed by Congress and signed by the president. You don't get to sit around and just be like, we think they're too corrupt. Like, that's not the way it worked. DOD actually did a legal analysis inside the Pentagon and found it was unlawful to do so. Like, this idea that the premise here is whatever gets passed into law, we just sit around and decide, like, are they corrupt or not? It's just bullshit.
Two things. One, it seems like this whole thing could be solved if someone just explained the concept of the cloud to Trump and Rudy Giuliani.
Honestly, I was just going to say this.
It's not a physical server.
There's
dude.
no server.
It's like Amazon Web Services, right? So that's one.
Do you know how email works?
Maybe a piece of it is in Ukraine.
2019.
What do I know? Two, right? Like, Mulvaney's right. The quid pro quos are at the heart of diplomacy, but the quo has to be something valuable to the United States of America. I can't say I'll give you military aid in exchange for $1 million. That is corrupting, as is the promise of dirt on Biden or future super PAC. Like, it's just so, like, their little linguistic games don't pass even a tiny bit of scrutiny. They treat voters like they are stupid.
I actually think like, so when I first saw the clip, I thought, oh, maybe they have a new strategy, which is to concede that he was doing sort of political interference of some form, looking backwards. That what he was,
Yes,
and they were kind of seeking a tiny bit of shelter in the last part of their kind of whatever misinformation hut. That was okay. Yeah, there was a quid pro quo. Yeah, we can't deny that part of it anymore. But there was nothing about Biden moving forward. It was just about looking backwards. And I think what he fucked up is the way that he could have maybe gotten away with that and say, like, of course there was a quid pro quo. Our quid pro quo was corruption in Ukraine for the money. We're not giving you money unless you investigate corruption. And one example is the conspiracy theory Trump brings up. Right. But he wasn't able to kind of land the plane.
Well, the other thing he's doing there, and this is what they're moving towards, is the Attorney General William Barr is running this investigation into the origins of the Mueller investigation to try to see if everything's on the up and up, to track down all the conspiracy theories. And because this has some air of legitimacy to it in their mind and in the press, in some parts of the press, they keep going to that by saying, well, when he was talking about this, like they don't want to mention what the server was or CrowdStrike because they know that's fucking nuts.
It's too nuts.
But they want to just say, oh, this was part of the Barr investigation, which then was ruined by the Justice Department.
Exactly.
Saying, we have no idea what he's talking about.
That was he got too specific because he said, like, at one point he said cooperation.
Too specific.
It was like
That's it.
too loud and too specific. It was like a cooperation, like, with the Department of Justice is one of the things he says, and then DOJ is like, that's the first we've heard of it.
Yeah, and I think it was Aisha Roscoe at NPR also pointed out at the briefing that if you're investigating the DNC in 2016, they're still a relevant entity in the 2020 election, right? Like, they're still your opponent.
Yes.
You're still investigating your political opponent.
Sorry. Can I make one more point about this too? Which is, there were a bunch of stories saying, like, the White House very unhappy with Mick Mulvaney. In a lot of ways, he was probably on the way out. Jared Kushner deeply disappointed in his performance. Which, honestly, if I were Mick Mulvaney, I was like, you little turd. The idea that you could have gone out there and handled this, you are disappeared because you're garbage. But I also think, like, they're like trying to act like Mick Mulvaney. He's just some guy. Like, Mick Mulvaney was the golden boy that they had run 2 agencies at once because he was one of the
Still is.
technically.
He's still the head of the OMB.
Right. He's still OMB. Is he? I don't even remember.
He's acting chief of staff in OMB.
Is what about CFPB? He was over there for a while too.
He's not there.
They got him out of that. But the point is,
they're getting the Supreme Court to kill the whole agency.
Yeah.
Probably.
Right. Yeah. No need to captain a sinking ship. But Mulvaney was one of the people that they viewed as their serious adult that was willing to stick around and do Trump's bidding, and so they put him into everything. So the idea now that Mick Mulvaney is like, that classic Mick, this guy nobody likes, is ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, apparently he got a round of applause at the morning staff meeting this morning at the White House, too.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
Yeah.
Round of applause.
Dead man walking. Yeah. It's like Green Mile or whatever.
I mean,
round of applause. Way to go, Mick.
How much strategic or political benefit do you guys think there is in the Mulvaney get over it defense? Like you said, there's 2 different strategies here.
I think that's the only thing they have. I mean,
it actually worries me because I think
that's all they have. And I think it's also what Trump's instincts are, and I think his instincts on this are probably better than the people around him in some weird way, just because he has like that shamelessness that almost no one can replicate. Like the problem is the facts are they've got locked into a situation where they admitted the crime. It's like the first page of the novel is like the crime is committed and we know who did it. And then the novel's told in flashback of like, oh, well, how do we end up with this like at the crime scene? And so they're in this weird place where they're trying to kind of deny things that keep coming out. We keep seeing how big and expansive this entire effort was. The only thing they will end up being able to do, and what the Republicans will take shelter in, is it was inappropriate but not impeachable.
Yeah.
Or like the Rob Portman statement is the way to sort of thread the needle if you're a Republican, particularly in the Senate and not in a crazily plus 25 Trump state, is to say this was not appropriate, but the money did flow. They didn't actually dig up dirt on Biden's, and everyone learned their lesson, and it's not impeachable. The problem is if you say that, you incur Trump's wrath.
Right.
So they're sort of stuck because the smart thing, I think, the argument to make is just concede the facts. All right?
I think it's also
stipulate the facts are the facts and the behavior is the behavior, and then argue over, in the same way that Democrats did with Bill Clinton, a very different infraction. But the argument with Bill Clinton wasn't, it was awesome and perfect that he had this relationship with an intern. It was this was not cool, but not impeachable.
Which I think is an argument for the Democrats to broaden the impeachment inquiry to various impeachable offenses by Donald Trump, because I do think part of what's hurting him here, as we saw the last couple of weeks with Ukraine and then Syria and then Doral, is the continuing development of these events over and over again of Trump's wrongdoing. You have to prove a pattern here. And I do think, like, the Tommy, you were mentioned Nate Cohn and the New York Times polling in these 6 swing states. And one of the numbers that sort of gave me pause was, I think 46% of people said they believed this kind of what Trump did with Ukraine was bad, but it's the kind of thing politicians do all the time. And
Cynicism.
42% said, no, it was uniquely bad. And I think there's a danger that people could fold this into people who are very cynical about politicians in both parties in general, saying, yeah, it's bad, but everyone's corrupt, and he's our corrupt guy, and that's that.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I also just think another difference, it's funny to look back at the Clinton impeachment, is one thing that Democrats had that Republicans don't is Bill Clinton had some really inappropriate conduct that wasn't criminal, and then obstruction and perjury to kind of cover up that misconduct that to varying degrees everybody said was wrong, but there was no crime. With Trump, the underlying conduct is criminal and incredibly dangerous.
Yes.
And then the cover-up is also a process crime to keep that concealed, which makes it much harder for them to go back to the kind of Clintonian avoidance.
To Chris's point on Trump's instincts, I think that's exactly right, because his starting place is, I'm corrupt, you're corrupt, we're all corrupt, who gives a fuck, right? Yes. But he is, I think, struggling in part because he's staffed by the D team that is overworked, that are not being replaced. And so, like, they released the Ukraine transcript. They released a letter from Trump to Erdogan that made him sound functionally illiterate. They released a Nancy Pelosi photo that will be hung at her memorial service in her home, in her speaker library, right? It's like their political instincts are off right now.
Yeah.
Well,
and that's why he is. I mean, every time a surrogate gets sent out, like, he's the only one who can do this. He's the only one who can pull it off because he's the only one. Again, it's biological. It's constitutive of who he is. It's like there's no other place in his mind that thinks that, like, everyone isn't as corrupt as him. Like so he can pull it off in a way that almost no one else can.
So, final question on this. Mulvaney's comments caused Republican Congressman Frank Rooney to say he won't rule out impeaching Trump. He then later announced he's going to be retiring. John Kasich called for impeachment. McConnell's out there writing an op-ed, very critical of Trump on Syria. Pierre Delecto, formerly known as Mitt Romney, has been obviously heavily critical. CNN reported over the weekend that many Republicans they talked to have used the phrase turning point. These are Republicans they talked to talk about what's going on right now. Do we buy this, or is this just like...
I think we don't know, but to go back to something Chris said earlier and something that I've thought for a long time, it was, I think, too cynical for a lot of Democrats to say, I know what Republicans will do. I'm from the future. I can predict how this will end up. And I think one thing that is just generally important for our posture is don't do the Republicans' work for them. Let's be surprised by what they do.
Well, and let's not sit back. I think it shows that, like, political pressure works here.
There's also the fact that, in this whole mix, because you just mentioned it, is that in the Syria policy is, I've just found it so fascinating because to me it's like, it's so revealing with someone like Lindsey Graham. It's like, oh, this is your project. Like, Lindsey Graham's project is maintaining a certain form of American military hegemony throughout the world, and particularly the Middle East. And he believes in that project with his very fiber of his being. Yeah. And that project is being betrayed before his eyes. And he is genuinely pissed about that. And a lot of other Republicans are. I think, like, some, for legitimate reasons, like, we're betraying this ally that fought side by side with their soldiers. And I think some for illegitimate reasons, the Lynn Cheneys of the world, who see this as a sort of American retreat and we're pulling out. But to the extent that doubts begin to be sown in the minds of Republicans about what this individual with this baggage and this judgment and this staff is doing with the American ship of state in this sort of grand sense, that to me is extremely worrisome and dangerous for them politically.
Yeah. The thing that's interesting, I sadly believe that a lot of voters don't care that much about foreign policy, and they're probably the rank and file people in the world don't know much about the Kurds and aren't as worried as we wish they were about what Trump's doing in Syria right now. But what Syria was the first moment a Fox-only viewer saw criticism of Trump that was real and sustained and personal, and from voices that they were like, wait, I thought he was our team.
Yeah,
and I think
exactly
that matters.
Right. Yeah.
And that matters a lot.
And that's where I think the Trump weakened story in the Post was great and smart, but they said at one point that he lost the media, and I just don't think that's true.
It's,
The Trump media.
there's a dirty deal that the Republicans have made, which is we'll tolerate all of these abuses, we'll tolerate his inhumanity and vulgarity and criminal abuses and deception and racism, as long as we get our list of things.
Yeah.
And for a lot of these Republicans, that's taxes and deregulation, that's judges, but there's a foreign policy code, like a shibboleth for them that this violates. And I think, like, okay, let's say Trump was a Democrat who was just as corrupt, but he campaigned on Medicare for all, and he campaigned on cutting taxes for the middle class, and he campaigned on all the things we believe in. Then he comes into office and he starts denying climate change. All of a sudden it's like, hold on a second, man. Hold on a second.
Yeah.
I'm on the take here, but I need my fucking cut.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be corrupt and not get my beak wet.
The other thing is, at the end of the day, every one of these Republican senators is going to make a purely political calculation in a way, right? Which is the public pressure on Trump? They're going to look at the polls. They're going to look at the polls in their state if they're up for re-election. At least the ones who aren't retiring.
The problem with that, I mean, that I totally agree with. But the problem is, if you ask me, and I'm not a political consultant, and I don't think I'd be a particularly good one, but if you ask me in an alternate universe in which I was like paid for advice to Republicans, I would say the Benjamin Franklin quote during the Revolution, we almost hang together or we will surely hang separately, is true. Like, you will, in the short term, it would be a political disaster for the Republican Party to vote to remove Donald Trump. Now, the second thing I would say is Watergate was a disaster, and 74 and 76 were disasters, and then it was like Ronald Reagan 4 years later. Like, nothing lasts forever, and there's an argument to be made to, like,
you need a cleanse.
Exactly. No, really. That, like, there's an argument to be made to just take your medicine and cleanse. But in the short term, I don't see any argument on the other side, purely amoral, just talking about political strategy here, that turning against Trump would be anything other than a just like extinction level event for Republicans.
Yeah, the only thing I wonder is when you see that Joni Ernst town hall and how difficult it is for some of these Republicans when confronted by non-Trump media reporters or constituents to defend this. Like, does that figure into the calculus of a Susan Collins, a Joni Ernst, Cory Gardner, Martha McSally, some of these Republicans that are up in 20. Now, I don't know if you need to get to 20 Republicans there, and I don't know if you can count to 20.
And I think there's a universe. I mean, that's a fascinating, like, micro version of the political question, and that is, I think, a really hard call. Like, if you're paid to advise them how to vote on this trial, like, that's a tough vote. First of all, we can all agree, it's a vote they don't want to take.
Yeah.
They do not want to take
Absolutely
that vote.
not.
But that's a tough vote. Like, if you're Cory Gardner, like, what's the upside? What's the downside? If you the people that you need to turn out for you are going to be furious at you and probably view you as a traitor, but also you're in a state that is, he's underwater by 15 points.
Let me rephrase the question. Think about this question. Okay, so hang together, hang separately, fine. If all the Republicans removed him, they would be protecting themselves. If all the Republicans vote to not remove him, they're protecting themselves. What would you rather be? Would you rather be a Republican senator who voted to remove and he stays in office? Or would you rather be a Republican senator that voted for him to stay while he's removed anyway?
Oh, definitely the former.
Yeah.
You don't want to vote. No, definitely the former. Yeah.
So that tells you something.
Yeah, although again, like part of what's so weird about the way our politics work now, in terms of like how deep the sort of structural polarization is like we're talking about two different universes of people. If you're a senator from Alabama, like none of this
it's not a hard one.
You're just dealing in a different universe if you're Richard Shelby than if you're Cory Gardner, and like the worlds in which like this sort of question at the margins in the middle like apply is such a narrow set of people, particularly in the House where all of those people are Democrats now. I mean, the 40 seats that are those kind of seats, most of them are now occupied by Democrats making these judgments. There's maybe another 10 marginal seats there, but everyone else is just living in a world where like this stuff is just
right.
And go ahead.
Clear.
There's collective and individual breaking points, and I don't think that there will ever be a collective breaking point as a party where they decide that politically it's beneficial for us to get rid of Trump. Even though I think you could probably argue that a cleanse at this point is needed. But for individuals, there's Cory Gardner, right? He's looking at polling. But to your point about Lindsey Graham and his like global military project. Today, the Trump administration announced that they had secretly brought 2,000 U.S. service members out of Afghanistan. That's an interesting thumb in the eye of Lindsey Graham in this moment of maximum tension with him around Syria.
There's also this amazing little human drama that's happening, which is a Gulf war between Rand Paul and Lindsey Graham.
Yeah.
Like, no, you can literally see it. Like, they have
awesome.
both invested so hard in flattering this guy into getting what they want. And Ted Cruz, when I spoke to Ted Cruz recently, the first thing he had said this to me once before, and then he said it again. He said, look, he's not a complicated guy. If you flatter him, you can get him to do what you want, and if you criticize him, he hates you. Right. And he just said that. I was like, right, this is and so you've got Rand Paul and Lindsey Graham who have both just been like, just throwing themselves at Donald Trump, golfing with him to get him to buy their vision of American foreign policy. And like, now Rand Paul's winning, and he's like these sort of celebratory tweets, and poor Lindsey Graham, all his golf is for naught.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, it's very slippery to try to nail down Trump on
Well,
that.
that's the thing.
I mean, but I do think like one political benefit of impeachment, we may not get him removed, but I do think all of these senators who are up in 2020 in these purplish states, their plan has always been to try to distance themselves from Trump at some point in the general election to show some kind of independence. And if they have to vote on impeachment and they vote to exonerate him, then they're never going to be able to separate themselves from Trump.
No,
and I think it's going to make life, even if he stays in office, it's going to make life much harder for Susan Collins and Cory Gardner and all of them. And if that's all we get from impeachment, then that is very much worth it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, when you think through the sort of psychology, when you game it out, you keep gaming it out, right? It's like, so what's Trump? What's the Republican Party going to do with Cory Gardner in Colorado? Like, you can't send Donald Trump to Colorado.
Nope.
to it's not
The
Texas.
altitude alone, he can't handle it.
He's probably not going to Maine. He's probably not. I mean,
No, I don't think he's going to Maine either. So it's like, again, the base only gets you so far, and for the people for who that doesn't carry the day, they're not in great. They're in a bad position.
All right, let's talk about the Democratic primary. Big news this morning is a new Suffolk USA Today poll out of Iowa that shows Biden at 18%, Warren at 17%, and Pete Buttigieg surging 7 points since their June poll to 13%. Bernie Sanders is at 9%. Everyone else is between 0 and 3%, and the winner is undecided at 29%. So only one poll, but we do know that Iowa polls in general have been better for Buttigieg than the national polls. We have seen a slight bump for him in several polls since the debate. What do we think accounts for the surge here for Pete? Obviously, he's been spending a lot of time in the debate and since the debate, drawing contrast with Elizabeth Warren on Medicare for All.
I think, it has always seemed to me the case that, and I think the lane metaphor really collapsed and didn't work in 2016, but it does seem to me that like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren both have strong ideological stories. They both clearly believe them down to their toes. Like they believe in what they're saying, and they have a vision for the project. So there's those two at the top. And then there's Joe Biden, who is Joe Biden.
Right.
Like that is why Joe Biden is Joe Biden. You know him, you love him, or you don't love him. He was Obama's vice president.
He has a clear story, whether he's articulated that story or not.
Yes. That gives you the top three. There's always been a question of like, who is telling a story, the primary field, a story, a vision, a kind of camp of like, I'm the person who's does not have this ideological vision that these two others have, which maybe some people in the primary, grassroots don't like. But I do have another vision, and I could be a kind of like essentially a non-Biden centrist to be overly reductive. And I think there is clearly a space for that in the race. And it just seems to me that Buttigieg is like that in a sort of remarkably abrupt way.
Well, that
it's like just
that was what I was going to get to.
Just be like, like swerve the car over to do that. But from a tactical perspective, it makes us
just blowing up a blow up doll so we can use the HOV lane, swerving. I'm using this lane whether you fucking like it or not.
I guess
so. That I think is what accounts. And that's what I think. And he's a pretty good retail politician. I think. That's
for sure. I guess that's my question, and it's been my question since the debate: is it too abrupt? And maybe the answer from this poll is no, it's not too abrupt because he's getting some traction.
I just think that this surge has actually been a long time coming.
Yeah,
and
that's the other.
It's showing up in multiple polls now. I mean, when I was in Iowa in August, like he had a pretty big crowd for a Tuesday afternoon at the state fair, bigger than others, and people were sort of noticing. He got hot early, right? And like, who the fuck thought that a CNN town hall super early on was going to lead to sustained momentum and money over time?
It was the Dan Pfeiffer interview on.
The Dan Pfeiffer interview. Cut that. Just kidding. The Dan Pfeiffer interview was going to lead to all this money, but like they have been building and organizing, and they've been on TV in Iowa, and it's actually mattered. And he's been in the national mix through the duration, which has been, I think a reason that people like Amy Klobuchar and Cory Booker and Beto O'Rourke have had a harder time.
Two things I want to say here. One is that the race part of this is a huge part of it too. Like, why is he doing? He's at zero with black voters, and so like Iowa's a place that he can perform, but like unless that changes, he's not going anywhere.
Yep.
Right.
The second thing I would say is that it just seems to me, and again, I'm like sort of talking about this not in terms of my own ideological commitments, but just sort of a descriptive sense. It's like, if you're looking for like who would be a person who's not Sanders and Warren because I think they're too far left or whatever, and who isn't Biden, who I think doesn't seem like he's at his sharpest. Like, Amy Klobuchar is a United States senator. She, in terms of an electability argument, just looking at the numbers, probably has the best argument in the field, just in terms of how she performs in Minnesota, the Republican districts in which she overperforms in. She overperforms in rural parts of that state. I don't think anyone's like right now getting like super fired up about Amy Klobuchar the way that there are some people about, Pete Buttigieg. But let's keep in mind, Pete Buttigieg won his last election in a race in which there were 10,000 votes cast.
Right.
I mean, that's like a large housing development in the Bronx where I grew up. Like
Well,
Amy Klobuchar has won in a state that, remember, Hillary Clinton only won by 10,000 votes last time around. That's a competitive state. Like, I just feel like on the numbers and the metrics, if you're making the tactical argument about this sort of like centrism combined with electability, she's got a stronger case just in the data than he does.
Well, it's also why I think Pete is leaning so heavily on this Medicare for All argument to draw a contrast with Warren, because he can't really get into an electability argument with Elizabeth Warren because for the reasons you just mentioned. But what he can do is present himself policy-wise as the more centrist alternative. The difficult part, of course, as he found out over the last week, is he sort of burst onto the scene as much more of a progressive truth teller, even though it was in fairness to Pete, he's been talking about Medicare for All who want it since February of 2019, so it's been there. But he said things like, Jake Tapper on Sunday interviewed him and was like, well, you criticized her about tax increases, but you've said to me at a debate, in the second debate, premiums or taxes, it's the same thing.
Right.
So I wonder how much of a hard time he's going to have,
I think we're also, we're in it, and we've seen all these sort of adjustments along the way. But I also think it's worth remembering, too, that I think Pete became a national figure by offering a non-ideological idea of what he was trying to do, right? It was a generational shift. It was what he represented.
He leaned heavily on democratic reforms, right? Like the Supreme Court and the filibuster, which are also, in a way, non-ideological.
Right. Well, they're big progressive ideas, but they're not on the kind of, left, right, how much do we tax, how much do we spend hinge. And I think so he's sort of, he's now made some really specific statements that put him more in the sort of center left of the party, despite what he said in the past. And the other piece of this about Klobuchar, too, is I do think it doesn't speak to what Pete has been doing. It kind of speaks more to what Amy Klobuchar wasn't doing. I think this fourth debate was the first time she really was strong in a way that was sort of made a case for her own candidacy. She was, I thought, energetic and emotional in defense of her worldview, which she hadn't done before. And, I think that's partly why she hasn't been able to kind of get a toehold into the polling.
I think it's also hard, though, like making the reason that Biden is sort of uniquely. It's still the case that the squishiness of what Mayor Pete was talking about, and I agree that it wasn't ideological per se, but it was like big at the same time, that the problem for people that want to occupy that space is like how to make an argument that feels big that isn't big in an ideological sense, because otherwise then you're just John Delaney getting his butt kicked by Elizabeth Warren.
You never want to be the wet blanket.
You don't want to be the wet blanket, and you also don't want to be like, we can make these little marginal reforms and we can do things at the edges and like better things aren't possible, the tweet. And that is a real challenge. It's a real challenge, and no one yet has figured out how to do that, how to sort of paint a narrative that feels big and rises to the scale of the issues that we all see in front of us and sort of fills up the scope of the times, that's independent from an ideological vision that Sanders and Warren have a very clear message about.
For example, like Obama in 2008 in that primary, right? Like there were
the classic example.
The classic example, because on healthcare in that primary, Barack Obama was further to the right than Hillary Clinton or John Edwards, and yet he was seen as.
Although the thing I will say about that, and you guys lived it, but I covered it, is that like the war did so much of that work.
That's exactly
That
right.
It just did all that work because it was like that was the number one issue for so long in politics, and he was on the right side of it, and the person he was running against was wrong, and he was on the left side of it, and that did so much of the work that Pete doesn't have a thing like that
That's
or Amy
exactly
Klobuchar
right.
to point to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like when you look at the distinction between Klobuchar and Pete, I think a lot of it could be boiled down to the fact that Pete broke through into the national conversation early, and he has a set of qualities that's particularly appealing to the donor class and to people who are really interested in talking about and diagnosing the challenges in our politics and the Democratic Party. Whereas,
Which is why he has so much money too.
why he raised a shitload of money. Whereas Klobuchar went had a harder time until I think she had a great debate recently, a harder time breaking through nationally, and was doing the more traditional grind it out in the early states strategy, which frankly hasn't worked for anyone this time yet.
She also was, I think, she was stronger and more critical she was better at making a sharper contrast with her opponents when she was off the debate stage than when she was on it. She was reluctant to kind of throw a punch in the debates. And, we can talk endlessly about whether throwing punches is always a good idea. But for her specifically, it was like, come on, we have seen center-left candidate just fall by the wayside, just getting absolutely brutalized by Elizabeth Warren. And I think this was the first debate, and Bernie Sanders, this was the first debate where you act like Mayor Pete and Amy Klobuchar are more sophisticated debaters than what the left has faced before, and I think the debate was stronger because of it.
Right. Yes, I totally agree with that. I mean, rather than the Delaney sort of stand-in. But I also think, I think this is a more ideological question, but I also think it's the case that there's a reason it's hard to spell out this vision that feels equal to the scope of the times that's not ideological, because politics is about what the ideological vision is for the country. There is a reason that the Sanders-Warren vision feels big. It's because it is big, because they believe that a lot of shit is fucked up and a lot of shit
they speak to the scale of the challenges.
Exactly.
Well, and if you don't agree with them, the only way around that is through it. You have to make the case that that's not either politically feasible, or from a policy substantive standpoint, it's not the right way.
Right.
But so many candidates, I think, have danced around it because they're afraid of the criticism. And so I think, Pete's sort of head down charging into the fray.
And I think, again, that I have tended to feel like most of the debates so far have largely revolved around what I would call clean hits, substantive fights about things that people have there's a big difference between universal single-payer healthcare as proposed or adding a public option. Those are distinct things that people can make good faith arguments, substantive arguments. The one thing I will say, not to get too policy here, but there's a little bit of hand-waving that's happening with the public option or Medicare for all who want it, and Dave Dayen at The Prospect pointed this out, which is so there's two possibilities.
I know.
Either it's a really good option that people want, in which case a ton of people are in it, and then you're dealing with a cost that looks a lot like Medicare for all, or it's kind of crappy and no one wants it. And then you could be like, well, we don't have to spend a lot of money on it. But it's well, what have you succeeded in doing then?
So David Remnick pressed Buttigieg on this point in an interview they did, I think, over the weekend. And I think the way that Pete thinks he's getting out of that is because there are still premiums, copays, deductibles, and Medicare for all. You have to buy. It's not like automatic enrollment and everyone gets, it's not like Bernie's
It costs less than Bernie Sanders, even apples to
even
apples.
if everyone's in.
That is
But
true.
you're right that if everyone loves Medicare for all who want it and everyone jumps in, they're going to have to find a financing mechanism that is greater than what Pete has already proposed.
Yes. Right.
And actually, it also gets at the argument Pete's trying to make against Warren, because what does that mean? Well, it means that the government is going to have to spend a greater share on healthcare as the amount people spend out of pocket on things like premiums slowly starts to fall, which is the ledger math that we've argued about in every single debate.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so another big development over the weekend was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's endorsement of Bernie Sanders at a rally in Queens that drew approximately 26,000 people. In her endorsement video, AOC said, "This is not just about running for president, this is about creating a mass movement of working-class people." How big of a deal is this endorsement?
I thought I don't know how much endorsements matter, and I don't think it was necessarily that surprising. I do think that there was a little bit of, after Bernie Sanders, a 78-year-old man who had a heart attack.
Yeah.
And I do think there was a little bit, and I think you saw it in the polling of is he going to be cool? Just physically, not a politics, substance, just literally physically. And I do think it was important for him, both to have a very strong debate performance where he seemed energetic and not like a man who's weak and just out of the hospital, and then to have this rally, to remind people, yes, he's in it, he's there. And the other thing I'll say is I just thought the ending of that speech
Yeah, it was great.
was so moving and beautiful.
Very powerful.
Like really powerful. Like it just like really, I was like, right, this is the project. The project is like look around and find someone that isn't like you, and like, are you willing to fight for them? And are we all willing to fight for each other? And I just thought it was like a very beautiful piece of rhetoric that captured what I want the project to be for all of us.
It was inclusive.
Yeah.
It was inviting of other people to
Yeah.
try to build a movement, which I think Bernie has always been pretty good at. I think sometimes his supporters are
Yes.
not as inviting.
Yes, exactly. No,
some of
that's
his supporters, I'd say, a lot of people who work for him are different, right? But like,
Yes.
so, you know, the online conversation, and when you hear him talk like that, and then I thought AOC's endorsement videos was one of the best endorsements I've seen. She's incredibly powerful. She's so good at this. So that's I feel like the case he made and the case that she made is the best case for Bernie
yes,
Sanders.
it's like
that's
go
out
with
there.
that. Exactly. I completely agree. Go with that.
I think this will actually turn out to be like I normally would agree that endorsements don't mean much, but I think this is a big deal and it will mean more over time because like obviously she helped him draw this huge crowd in Queens, and she did an incredibly compelling video that I thought made a better case for Bernie Sanders than Bernie Sanders often makes for Bernie Sanders. But then like she's a campaign staffer as of like a year ago, right? Like she knows how this works. She will hit the road, she'll work for him, and she will draw huge crowds everywhere she goes. And the one question I had as I looked at the event was, why do this in Queens? Why not do this in Des Moines?
Right.
And I talked to some of Bernie's folks, and their argument was basically like, one, we kind of give endorsers the respect of coming to them first. So don't be surprised if you see her in in Des Moines down the road. But also like the national narrative, as you said, Chris, has changed a lot over 3 weeks. It's kind of an amazing whipsaw for them, but they think that the way you showed that you're the biggest, baddest grassroots campaign in town is to pull off an event like that. And I certainly that was a brushback pitch to the Warren campaign, to everyone else that's trying to say, this is a movement.
And I will say that Warren, it also doesn't hurt to do something in the national media's backyard. Like the Warren event in Washington Square Park did that very well. It was like, oh my goodness, like it's right there. You can't ignore it. I will also say, I mean, the funny thing about Western Queens at this point is that like, it's the beating heart of like the revived democratic socialist movement in a real way. Like you can lose sight of it in the world of online and Twitter, but there are both in the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez campaign and then the campaign for the Queens DA, Tiffany Caban. My brother was a campaign manager on that, so I have some insight into it. Like there are just a bunch of people who are just non-political professionals who go knock on doors. Like there's a real organization that has been built there. It's a remarkable thing. It's not just like a bunch of people in people's Twitter mentions. There are people that like get off their shift from work and then they go hit doors for socialist candidates in that part of the borough and throughout the borough. And it's like, in some ways, there's something being built there that's a very real thing. It makes sense to go to the heart of it.
And I do wonder from this endorsement, we just talked about Pete's surge, and now we talked about sort of Bernie's sort of mini resurgence here. If the Warren campaign is about to go through sort of a challenging part of the race right now, that they haven't really been challenged like that since the beginning, the very beginning. And I think we talked about this for the last couple of weeks, like what is it going to be like when Elizabeth Warren faces a real challenge, because every candidate who does go on to win the nomination goes through that. And so I'm sort of wondering now, in addition to what happened at the debate, now, for a while it seemed like, oh, maybe Bernie's not going to be much of an issue, but he's there. He's got AOC. He can still pull off a 26,000 person event. Yeah. He is not going anywhere.
No.
That's, I think, the most important part of this. So, if AOC had endorsed Elizabeth Warren, it might have transformed the race, right?
Yes,
it would have
right.
shown Bernie
Yes.
would have continued to lose support. It would have meant that the left was now rallying behind one candidate to make sure that Joe Biden or someone in the Joe Biden lane, people who are just fucking tailgating Joe Biden, honking his horn, saying, "Get out of here!"
with his blow up doll.
Get out of my lane. You get out of here. I'm fucking clear.
You're driving 40 miles an hour.
You're driving 40 miles an hour while telling a story to no one. This, I think, will allow Bernie Sanders to find whatever his maximum is, right? And I think that's been the question from the beginning. Is it, what is the Bernie Sanders vote? What is the Bernie Sanders vote absent an anti-Hillary vote? Is it 25? Is it 30? Is it 35? And I think he's going to get to find out what that is, because now he has this incredible kind of launching pad for a Revive campaign.
And here's the thing about the Sanders campaign. It's always struck me that it's like, it's self-testing. Its theory of the case is actually like will be tested by the primary, right? Because the theory of the case is like there's lots of people that you can who are marginal or disaffected, and you can organize to bring them together to build a political coalition that's powerful. If you can, like, you can either do that or not in the primary.
Yeah.
Like if you can do that, then that shows that you're correct and have something really remarkable and powerful. If you can't, then the theory doesn't work.
Right. That's exactly right.
And I also sort of like, there was a lot of coverage. Like, why is AOC doing this? Why is she doing that? And then you watch the video and you listen to what she has to say, and you realize, like, because Bernie Sanders seems to have meant a lot to her.
Right. Sometimes it's nothing more.
She called Faz. She called Bernie's campaign manager while Bernie was still in the hospital to say, "I'm in. I'm ready to endorse." That's a pretty goddamn principled time to do it.
Yeah, and I do think, yes. And I do think also, I think part of the dynamic inside of this primary, I think it's true for some Warren supporters, I think it's true for Bernie supporters, is you look at this political landscape and you say, like, can we have what we want? You know, is it possible? Is it possible to, like, this time, like, we made the worst person in our country president. Politics was upended.
Yeah.
What if we can have a person that we don't have to, like, hold our nose to vote for? Like, what if we can have the person of our dreams? And I think for a lot of people that's Bernie. I think a lot of people that's Warren. And I think for a lot of people are looking at this and wondering just what does it mean in 2020 to choose a candidate? How much do we get a say, not as pundits, but as people who want something from politics?
So that brings us to Tulsi Gabbard. We should briefly mention what's going on with her and Hillary Clinton. In an interview on David Plouffe's new podcast, Campaign HQ, Hillary said, quote, "I'm not making any predictions, but I think the Russians have got their eye on somebody who is currently in the Democratic primary and are grooming her."
John's holding his hands over his eyes. Which is sort of how I feel about this entire news cycle.
I love that. I'm not making predictions, but here's something I think's going to happen.
And are grooming her to be the third-party candidate. She's a favorite of the Russians. She was not talking about Amy Klobuchar.
No, she's talking about Marianne Williamson.
Yeah, right. So Tulsi Gabbard
Spoiler.
responded with quite a tweet. "You, the queen of warmongers, embodiment of corruption and personification of the rot that has sickened the Democratic Party for so long, have finally come out from behind the curtain. It's now clear that this primary is between you and me. Don't cowardly hide behind your proxies. Join the race directly." It was such a journey following these three tweets, because at first she's like attacking Hillary, and then you're like, wait, she's challenging her to get in the race?
Surprised there wasn't a duel.
It read like what you read to someone as someone lights the pyre on which they are about to burn. You, the queen of warmongering.
I mean, do you think it was a specific reference to Game of Thrones and Daenerys Targaryen? Because it
Probably.
seemed very.
Yeah.
Why do we think? Let's start with Hillary. Why do we think Hillary said that? I listened to the podcast before it broke, and it's funny. It took a little while because Plouffe's got this new podcast, and I was listening to it Wednesday on my drive home, and I'm like 25 minutes in, and she just casually drops this, and you hear Plouffe just sort of sits there in silence, doesn't say anything, and kind of just moves on to the next topic, because I think Plouffe's like, what was that? And then at the very end of the podcast, Plouffe comes on himself, and he's just like, so that was an interesting conversation with Hillary Clinton. I do think that bit about Tulsi Gabbard might make some news.
You think? I mean, my thoughts on this are she shouldn't have said that. It's just like, there's a certain part of the discourse that is obsessed with hating on people that talk about Russia.
Yeah.
But the kernel of the point they have is that it is insidious to the political culture of the country to view everything through the kind of as some marionette puppeteer issue, that it replays some of the most toxic, insidious tropes of the Cold War and all that came with that. And it's just not a good way to talk about our politics. I think that Tulsi Gabbard's politics are strange.
Yeah.
Indescribably strange in some ways. I
And
literally
some
don't know the term.
Very bad, I think.
The way I view her I really view her as the Ron Paul of the Democratic Party, in that you can't quite say what is the project as a whole is less well defined than Ron Paul, but also in the way that Ron Paul was right about some things and really right about some things and horribly wrong about some other things.
Yes.
And that was the Ron Paul contradiction. That was always the case. He was right about the Iraq War. That's a big thing to be right about. Yeah. He was wrong about a lot of other things. And so Gabbard's sort of political and ideological profile is her own and weird and distinct. I think the thing that Clinton said was bad and she shouldn't have said it. The response, though, is just again, what are you doing exactly here is really what's at the root of this.
Why are you going on Tucker Carlson to defend yourself?
You are not comporting yourself as a person who is attempting to win a Democratic Party primary. You just are not. So you're building your profile for your ideological movement. Fine. But what is that ideological movement aside from getting out of regime change wars, which again, not wars, regime change wars, which is always an interesting tell because she's for the global war on terror and she is for the use of the authorization to use military force in many spheres of combat in which we're killing people like Somalia. Like she thinks that we should keep doing that. She's very specific about regime change wars. And it's like, I just don't get what the actual project you are trying to boost here is fully.
Yeah,
I don't either. And she's also, I mean, again, she was, she's had some weird politics in that she was against the Iran deal. She was criticizing Obama for not saying radical Islamic terrorism. She was against more Muslim refugees coming to the country.
She was like the lone Democratic vote against increasing the amount of Syrian refugees.
There's plenty on
That's
the substance
bad.
to criticize Tulsi Gabbard on, for sure.
Yes.
I also just think, like, I personally find the constant "this is helping Putin" Twitter conversation to be exhausting. I also think, by the way, those people are ironically helping fucking Putin by giving him credit for every bad thing that ever happens in the country.
Yes.
Now, I don't think, like, what has now been ascribed to Hillary Clinton that she called Tulsi some sort of secret agent for Putin is not at all what she said.
No.
Right? She said she thinks that the Russians would love a third-party spoiler in the race the way Jill Stein is. All of this, to me, just understandably boils down to a deep-seated anger about the 2016 election, what happened. And by the way, like, I think David Plouffe will be the first one to tell you that you're not going to roll out big breaking news on his like third episode of his podcast at minute 35, right? Like,
The people thought it was some plan.
No, wasn't
No.
Now, Tulsi, her campaign smartly was like, oh, fuck me, fuck you. I'm going to lean into this and get the most press I've gotten. But to your point, Chris, about winning a Democratic primary, you don't delay your event with Iowa caucus goers to go on Tucker Carlson, right? Like, that's not how you win a Democratic primary.
Exactly.
And I do think the larger conversation that Plouffe and Clinton were having, which was about the danger of a third-party candidate in 2020, is a good conversation to have, and it's something that is very scary.
Right, but it's also self-defeating to phrase it in this way. I mean, the point is that, like, there are people who are not Tulsi Gabbard, who support Tulsi Gabbard, who are gettable Democratic Party votes that you want as part of the majority coalition to defeat Donald Trump, and, like, this is not a good way.
Well, also, Hillary Clinton is incredibly smart, right? And even if she is very concerned that that the Russians or Russian bots or right-wingers or whoever it may be are boosting Tulsi Gabbard, right? Are boosting Jill Stein because they want this.
And it's true. There are weird-ass right-wingers boosting
she's
Tulsi
right about
Gabbard.
that, yeah.
Like Richard Spencer, Steve Bannon. Like,
the problem is the word grooming, right? Because
it's a weird term.
A weird word. But I think if you're worried about that, one way that's going to be more true is if you talk about it and elevate it, right? So even from just purely from a strategic point of view, even if Hillary Clinton was exactly right in what she was saying it and making news about it, now we're all living in it.
Yeah, I do think though too, like, part of this is, forget 2016. I think there's so much anxiety about 2020, about how the primary is going to turn out, and Tom Steyer gets the first applause of the night by saying any person on this stage would be a better president than Donald Trump, and I think, people are going to make, Mayor Pete going after Elizabeth Warren on how she's going to pay for health care. It's about Mayor Pete, right? Doing something helpful for him that's hurtful to her, even if she's the nominee, let's say, right? But that's politics. That's what happens in a primary. They duke it out. They try to hurt each other. And the idea is everybody gets stronger along the way. But Tulsi Gabbard goes out there and threatens to quit the debate for reasons that are kind of
so
strange.
Weird.
Yeah.
There are, that you wonder, like, how far is she going to take her campaign? What are her interests? And I think there's a fear that Tulsi Gabbard's lack of any ideological kind of clarity that's confusing to people, her kind of reputation as a bit of a chaos candidate leads people to fear that this is someone who doesn't understand or isn't bought into the collective project of whatever happens is we have to do everything we can to defeat Donald Trump together.
And I think that is a completely legitimate fear. I mean, I think I don't know, even if I've never had the chance to interview her since she started running. I've talked to her a bunch before then. She was much more of a kind of like part of the Democratic Party previously. And I say I should say that not know, like, I don't know, right? I just genuinely don't know. That's what I mean, like
an
honest good faith question of, like, do you actually feel that way? Do you feel the way that Tom Steyer felt? Do you feel that, like, the Democratic nominee and the Democratic Party and the coalition that's represented by this, in your mind, very flawed, rotten, and corrupt party, which, okay, that is the only alternative to the continued menace of this person, and also the ideological project of the Republican Party, which is menacing in its own right. Like, that's obviously a thing that everyone, I think, shares 100% on that stage, and I think it's not a crazy thing to ask if that is her current position.
There's also just a weird thing this time around where the DNC rules that allow you to get on the debate stage mean that support is support for some of these guys. Right? Andrew Yang dealt with this early on, that he had some support from like the 4chan, Joe Rogan world, and he was constantly asked to disavow these individuals. And he, to his credit, he did. But does anyone think that those people kind of liking universal basic income or some interview he did made him a bad guy or an extremist? No.
Right.
So it's like, it's very hard. Just like putting my, like, I'm a Tulsi staffer hat on, if you're constantly asked to denounce the people that are giving you TV airtime or saying nice things about you, of course, at some point you're gonna balk at that.
The thing I will say, though, about Yang, and I think it's interesting to compare the two, because they're both of them are people that are in a Democratic primary that are carving out a space, I think, in their rhetoric, their ideological vision, and their support that is different than a standard Democratic candidate, quite different, right? Is that it just seems to me that like Yang has his posture is like additive and coalitional building as just like a rhetorical posture and as a personal posture in a way that it doesn't feel like Gabbard's is.
No.
Gabbard's feels like process of elimination and like who the sort of like, and then partly that's populist rhetoric and who the kind of corrupt insiders are. But Yang strikes me as someone who really is like trying to build something, trying to additively build something out in the Democratic Party that speaks to a part of the Democratic Party. And
friendly to the other candidates.
Yeah.
Tulsi in that moment was trying to go after Elizabeth Warren for supposedly supporting wars in the Middle East. And Warren
Which, again,
actually
is
made a bit of a flub. She said, yeah, I'd get all troops out of the Middle East. Obviously, she meant
In
Syria,
combat,
but it got changed to mean all these various
and again,
permanent
that's
bases
that's
we
a
have.
fair again. That's a
good
totally
debate.
fair and good debate. And like her playing that role is good. It's just that like I just can never quite. And maybe there's not an answer to it, and it doesn't matter that like there has to be some box and label that's wrapped around the whole project of Gabbardism. But like when you look at the policies, you look where she's been on a variety of things. It is just very hard for me to just figure out what the project is.
Yeah. So before we go, I want to talk about your outstanding podcast, Why Is This Happening? And you have a live show tonight at the Ace Hotel in Los Angeles.
Yeah,
while
we're
you're
doing
here.
a live show tonight at the Ace Hotel, which is an amazing venue. I think you guys have done something there.
Yeah.
It's a great venue. We got Adam McKay, the legendary Adam McKay, head SNL writer, co-founder of Funny or Die, Anchorman, Talladega Nights, and then he's on The Big Short and Vice. And part of this originated in a dinner I had with Adam where like it was like after a screening of Vice in which like he spent much of the dinner haranguing me about not covering climate enough. And I was like, dude, make a climate movie. Like, what I cover a lot of climate. Like, why are you? But
you have some pull.
he is really obsessed with climate and also thinking about how do you represent the climate crisis as film, art, TV. And the other guest is a guy named Omar Al-Akkad, who's an incredible guy who was born in Cairo, lived in UAE, and then he grew up in Canada when he was 16, and he was a war correspondent covering the War on Terror for 10 years and wrote this novel called American War, which is set in this sort of dystopic future America after climate change and the banning of fossil fuels and a second civil war. And we're going to just talk about, like, how do we talk about, represent as a cultural phenomenon the central crisis of our times, which is a very hard thing to kind of get your arms around and isn't being represented, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
Like, corollary to the level of import it has.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, speaking of that, I thought one of your most fascinating recent episodes is you interviewed Ted Cruz in Texas.
Your mentor.
And you guys,
mentor.
And I thought first of all, that was a fascinating conversation. I did think like, a lot of people would be like, why are you interviewing Ted Cruz for? But it's like, it was an interesting conversation. Good for him for sitting with you in front of a crowd that was very progressive and like having generally a good faith discussion with you about all these issues. But I do think Ted Cruz on climate change, man.
That was wild. I expected him, Mitt Romney put out this climate thing the other day.
Yeah.
Like, there's a way to just be like, yes, this is what the science says, and the world is getting warmer. And then there's a lot of yada-ing you can do after that because it's such a hard problem. Well, but China and India, but we shouldn't. But also there's all these jobs in natural gas, and what are we going to tell those people? You can do all that. But he went with the like circa 2005 Inhofe with a snowball on the floor of the Senate. Like, oh, but the satellite data is incomplete, and actually we're gaining ice, and like he was hitting me with all these sort of like tropes of denialism, which I was just surprised to hear in 2019 because it's just like I said afterwards on Twitter, I was like, let's make a bet donated to the charity of your choice of will there be more record highs or record lows in Texas in the year 2020? Let's just bet on that. Are going to be more record high or record lows in Texas in 2020? Actually, let's make that bet for 2021 and 2022 and 2023. Like, what are we doing here? Like, it's clearly.
I thought it was fascinating when you said, okay, so why are all these scientists and everyone all getting together to try to invent this conspiracy of global warming and climate change, you know? And he said that from a political angle, and I imagine a lot of conservatives think this.
They do.
That what this is about is a lot of the solutions, or most of the solutions to climate change involve the government, and this is basically a backdoor way for liberals and progressives
to get what they want
to
anyway.
have a socialist takeover of government using climate as the fig leaf, which I was like, wow. But you know what? That makes sense for all of them.
That's a completely widespread view. Mm-hmm. And to give it a little bit of credit, like, it's not a crazy view. It's a crazy view if you think that's what, like, that's why the scientists are doing it.
Right,
like, particularly if you've ever like met a climate scientist, is like, you know, like, oh, I've been tracking the latitude of where butterflies mate in England for 32 years of my life, and then I looked at the data and like, oh, it turns out they're mating higher and higher, like lower and lower on the map because of, you know, the change in climate. And it's like, that's not a person who's involved in some crazy like scheme to, you know, like, that's a person who's like literally went into it for the butterflies.
How much does Soros pay you?
Yeah.
Well, it's the same conspiratorial mindset that they think that all Democrats support immigration reform because we want to register millions more people of color in this country so that we can win.
Imagine if Democrats were so political.
I know, right?
But yeah, it goes back to what you were saying too about the cultural impact of stories about climate change, because I think one of the challenges, and I think, you know, people say that to us, you should talk about climate change more, but I do think we all should be talking about it more. But one of the challenges is you say to yourself, who is getting this information? Because there's the consumers of the kind of content that talks about the importance of tackling climate change that is reaching people that already understand that and want to do something and aren't sure how to get the political system to change. And then there are Ted Cruz and all the people that support Ted Cruz that we need to figure out how to change their thinking about this and their behavior about this.
Although I will say this, I mean, a lot of that change has really happened. I think partly it's just because of what's happened on the face of the earth. Like, but it's been two things to me. It's been the fact that like the signal has emerged from the noise and the data to the extent that people feel it and see it in their daily lives. I mean, my wife and I both turned 40 this year. We took a little like trip to Paris, and we went to the Loire Valley, like an hour and a half outside Paris, where had wine and grapes for 1,000 years. And it's like, these people, this is all they do. This is all they think about for 1,000 years. And they're like, yes, it's changing, and like, this is what's happening. We have to start planting new grapes. They were making a joke about like how everybody's grapes are going to like move up one tier. So like, we're going to start growing what southern Spain was growing. And then like England's going to start making wine because like they're going to be warm enough. And it's like, it's just there. Like the people that deal with the earth every day, like, see it. So there's that, and then there's also, I think, the activism of the movement has been so profound and powerful that, like, the persuasion question to me is almost a kind of distant third to those two in terms of mobilizing the political constituency you want. But it was still shocking to me in that Ted Cruz conversation. I was genuinely surprised that was the rhetorical route that he was taking.
He's still arguing about the data.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thank you, Chris, for joining us.
Thank you. That was
and
great.
Everyone go check out Why Is This Happening? If you're in LA and you hear this pod,
come tonight. There's still a few tickets left. Yeah.
Perfect.
Come by the Ace Theater. It'll be, I think, 7:30. 7:30. Come by a ticket at the box office.
All right. And when we come back, we'll have Tommy and Ben's interview with